This video contains spoilers for Resident Evil 4 Remake, its Separate Ways DLC, and the original Resident Evil 4. Viewer discretion is advised. If you've been following the Resident Evil series since its early days, then you know the story of Resident Evil 4. The head honcho of the series at the time, Shinji Mikami, spent a good chunk of years crafting the fourth entry in the series that he helped birth, going through several iterations and reboots until we eventually got Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 4? It was something unexpected, different, and revolutionary. The game dialed back some of the series' horror and survival aspects and focused more on an arcade-like action shooter experience. This allowed it to become the progenitor of what we know as the modern third-person, over-the-shoulder shooter game. Resident Evil 4 was a turning point for the horror genre, third-person shooter, and the Resident Evil series itself. By decreasing both the horror and survival horror aspects of the series, Resident Evil 4 was able to welcome a new swath of players to the series. And that success is what led publisher and developer Capcom to try and recreate that same phenomena again and again. First with Resident Evil 5, and then 6. And if you're familiar with the Resident Evil series, you know how the story ends, with fans hating the direction of the series, and Resident Evil 5 and 6 being viewed as the low points of the whole series. But hey, that little story is a history lesson from the early 2000s. Today, in 2024, things are actually quite a bit different. Resident Evil actually ended up going back to its survival horror roots with its 7th entry, and a successful Resident Evil 2 remake brought that Resident Evil 4 style camera and married it with the series' survival horror DNA, in a way that brought fans back and got them genuinely excited for the series. And it's in this time frame that we got Resident Evil 4 Remake last year. And well, Resident Evil 4 being remade was always going to be a bit of an interesting situation. How do you remake the game that de-emphasized horror and is also known as one of the best games of all time? It's a question that I really believe Capcom and the team that made the Resident Evil 2 remake had to answer. And the answer that they came up with? Well, it's both totally on brand for them, and I'd argue is the second turning point for the Resident Evil series, in a way that we'll see play out in the next few years as more remakes and Resident Evil entries trickle out from the team over at Capcom. So, Resident Evil 4 Remake then. What exactly did this game do that makes it seem like another definitive moment for the Resident Evil series and horror games as a whole? It's simple, really. Resident Evil 4 Remake shoves the survival horror aspects that the original Resident Evil 4 removed back into the same game. If the original Resident Evil 4 was all about making a game that was fun, more approachable, and focused on giving the player a good time, then Resident Evil 4 is almost like a rewrite of history. Rather than try to recapture that odd balance of creepiness and fun action that only the original Resident Evil 4 has ever managed to do, Resident Evil 4 Remake feels like an attempt to bring the classic game to be more in line with the rest of the series and its horror-based experiences. But of course, injecting more horror into the story, gameplay, and experience of Resident Evil 4 isn't as simple as it probably sounds. Since the original Resident Evil 4 was so focused on an experience that catered towards thrills and keeping the player going on its roller coaster ride, changing that experience into a horror game is all about making some fundamental changes, and of course, those will come with trade-offs. Now, before we jump into anything else, it's worth asking, is Resident Evil 4 Remake as impressive and revolutionary as the original? I think you can answer that somewhat confidently with a no. By its very nature, a remake just can't innovate or disrupt things in the way that the new, bold fourth entry in the Resident Evil series did all those years ago. Yet, I do find that what the team did create with Resident Evil 4 Remake is really impressive and revolutionary in its own, smaller way. There's a lot of changes, some subtle, some overt, that really shift and transform the experience of the original Resident Evil 4 into something different and unique. I mean, you only have to look at the very beginning of the game to see how this remake approaches the concepts and ideas of Resident Evil 4 in a way that feels and hits rather different. The decision to set the opening of the game at night rather than the middle of the day like the original really ups the creepy factor of the game in a big way. And that shift kind of extends to every aspect of the game's world and story. Resident Evil 4 is a lot more serious. It throws away some of the whimsy and camp of the original and replaces it with a story that feels more realistic and evokes the idea of horror to a much better degree. It's not an entirely different story, but this is a darker, grimmer, and more serious take on the events of Resident Evil 4 as they happened in the original. And sure, there are some cons to this rather big change. The characters, of course, feel both less over the top, and I'd argue a bit less interesting on the one hand. On the other hand, they also feel like real people, and seem to react more realistically to the situations that they're put in the events of the game. Gone is the Leon who wisecracks his way through every horrible thing that he runs into, and he's replaced by a guy that's a bit more driven and has a bit more rage to him. Then there's Luis, who loses some of his charm, but gains more screen time and some serious depth to his character that wasn't in the original game. Ashley, on the flip side, graduates from being the damsel in distress to an actual character that grows and goes through a proper character arc in the game. The antagonists, on the other hand, get the worst downgrade of the bunch. They lose some of their James Bond-esque villain traits and become more cookie-cutter and generic villains. Are they less interesting? Sure. But do they fit more with what's happening on the island and the events of Resident Evil 4 as a whole? I'd argue they do, totally. And the end result of all of this is a bit debatable. But I think Resident Evil 4 is able to successfully turn the dial towards a more serious, grim, and darker experience with its storytelling, characters, and world building. I certainly miss some of the charm that was lost from the original, but I say that it's this newer version of the experience that feels more Resident Evil. Is that a good thing? A bad thing? I think that really will vary from person to person, and what that person's opinions are on both Resident Evil 4 and the earliest entries of the series. But it's not just the narrative experience that gets some significant changes, but the gameplay as well. Where the original Resident Evil was a game that focused more on having you shoot down as many parasite-infected villagers and monstrosities as possible, littering you with ammo and weapons and healing items, the remake focuses on something else entirely for its core gameplay experience. Much like the story, the gameplay experience shifts to a more tense and uneasy experience. Resident Evil 4 Remake isn't the power fantasy that the original was. It's a game that has you play a more desperate Leon, that scrapes together what he can and makes it out of the various situations and battles that he finds himself in by the skin of his teeth. In one word, the description of Resident Evil 4 Remake's gameplay is definitely challenging. You get less resources, enemies move faster, are more aggressive, and even things like your knife have a degradation mechanic to go alongside an expanded set of moves and capabilities. The game is tuned in such a way that you always feel just a bit less fully capable of taking down any particular scenario or horror that you run into. And hey, it's clear where the focus was here. Resident Evil 4 is a more tense, unnerving, and nail-biting experience. Keeping track of your ammo, making sure your shots are well placed, and scrounging for treasures are all key parts of the gameplay that you need to engage in order to survive Leon's adventure on your first playthrough. Even Ashley, who felt like more of a side distraction in the original game, is more front and center in the remake, with less places for her to hide, and you having less control over directing her as a whole. As such, you'll find yourself actively keeping track of Ashley and where she is, lest you run into a quick game over, as she can get caught a lot more often and be whisked away by enemies even faster than she was before. You can also, of course, shoot her yourself on accident. And all these changes, while some of them could be even called frustrating, contribute to a more tense experience for the game as a whole. And like before, whether you find this experience better than the original's more chill and shoot style will definitely vary from person to person. My guess is that fans of the more classic survival horror-esque games of the series are going to really love the changes here, while fans of the original Resident Evil 4, the ones that came into the series with that game, are going to feel a bit alienated. And it's those fans of the original that I think will notice some of the cuts and edits that the remake makes in terms of the original game. A few locations are toned down, some places are added, and some iconic things like the laser room are left for the more expanded Separate Ways DLC that features Ada Wong as its main character, which, incidentally, is another big change from the original. While Separate Ways was a short, fun little mode included in the original Resident Evil 4 when it came to the PS2, Separate Ways in the remake is almost required to fully enjoy, experience, and understand what's going on in not only Resident Evil 4 Remake, but likely future titles in the series as well. Luis, who we talked about earlier, is a character that feels a lot more roguish and slimier in the base game. But in Separate Ways, he's really developed and fleshed out in a way that makes him feel pretty sympathetic. Ada Wong, on the other hand, who got a bit of a shafting in terms of her character and voice acting in the base game, fares a little bit better in the DLC. While the voice acting and direction of her character still feels a bit stiff and a step down from the original, what she gets to do in her campaign really completes the experience of the remake. Things like the laser room being an actual boss fight, or Ada facing off against one of the two Vertigo that Sadler seems to have with him as a consistent threat, are just some of the things that expand the overall experience of the DLC. There's even callbacks to stuff like an earlier cancelled version of Resident Evil 4 in the DLC, where Ada has to fight apparitions in a way that's very reminiscent of that leaked Hook demo of the original game. Even a boss that was cut from the base game makes an appearance as a remixed boss for Ada to take on, and that's U3 and the second Vertigo being one and the same thing. It's cool stuff, and that combined with a more present and direct role for Wesker in the story, who's obviously the series antagonist, definitely seems to be setting things up for a potential Resident Evil 5 remake or a Code Veronica remake. Which finally brings us to the big thing that Resident Evil 4 Remake accomplishes. See, while there's an argument to be made that Resident Evil 4 was fine the way it was, and that this horror conversion of the game was wholly unnecessary, that's a lot less true for the games that follow Resident Evil 4. What makes Resident Evil 4 Remake so interesting is the potential that it sets up for the remakes of Resident Evil 5, Code Veronica, and 6. What would a darker, grimmer, and scarier Resident Evil 5 even look like? How would Capcom even do it? They would have to significantly change the game in order to make it fit into this new horror mold that their remakes have been fitting into thus far. Whether Capcom decides to go into the direction of remaking Code Veronica, or whether they go straight to Resident Evil 5, one thing is clear. More changes are going to be needed, and I imagine with these less beloved entries in the series, those changes will be welcome. And I think that is how Resident Evil 4 Remake will ultimately be remembered. I expect and imagine that as we get heavily modified versions of the remaining Resident Evil games that haven't had remakes yet, Capcom and its Resident Evil team will continue to course correct and adjust things to keep them more in line with the franchise's core horror feel and roots. If you're a fan of Resident Evil, then all of this should be very exciting. Seeing a proper horror-centric version of Resident Evil 5, and perhaps an entirely remade and different Resident Evil 6, is something that now seems possible. And all of it was or will have been started by taking on and adjusting the most beloved and popular of all the Resident Evil games. Now, the path is open, and I suspect everything will continue to change and evolve in a way that will please not only classic fans of the series, but bring newer fans to a franchise that feels like it's really breathing and living again. Resident Evil 4 Remake is another turning point for Resident Evil. It's both a rewriting of history and the paving of the way for a different and more exciting future for the franchise. Regardless of whether you love the changes in Resident Evil 4 Remake, that, I think, is the core thing that Resident Evil 4 Remake brings to the table. A path back to horror for some of the more divergent titles in the series.